We talked about underdevelopment. What about large-scale variation in the other direction? What would overdevelopment of these social brain traits, these highly developed inhuman traits, look like? Well, let's go through them one by one. Instead of normal language, hearing what people say to you, you can have voices appearing out in your brain, essentially out of nothing. Auditory hallucinations, which are surprisingly common among humans, as it turns out. Instead of a normal, humble sort of sense of self, we can have delusions of grandeur, what we refer to as megalomania, believing that we are someone famous and powerful and influential, and historically that must have been a pretty good deal for reproductive success, let me tell you. Instead of normal mentalistic skill, thinking about what other people might be thinking of you in a normal, everyday sort of context, we can have an overdevelopment such that we believe that people are plotting and colluding and conspiring against us. And we characterize this as paranoia. It's a form of social delusion. So we put these three together and we have three of the primary traits that make up what we refer to as psychosis. To complete the list, if we extend normal social emotionality, we get the low lows of depression and the high highs of elation. Overdevelopment of logic and analytic skill can involve what we call thought disorder. This is when thought and speech become chaotic. There is no logical connection between thoughts and words. People jump very rapidly from one train of thought to another, have very loose associations connecting their speech. And finally, complex regulated goal pursuit. If we take this too far in terms of overdevelopment, we have something that we call mania, where one becomes extremely energetic and engages in dysregulated, essentially out of control goal pursuit, especially with regard to sex and money. Now, what I've just described has also been referred to as the psychotic affective spectrum, which is made up of three related disorders: schizophrenia, involving hallucinations, delusions, paranoia, thought disorder, and dysregulated mood; bipolar disorder, defined in terms of mania, depression, and also in some forms of bipolar psychosis; and major depression, of course, depression, and also in severe cases you get psychosis. These three conditions share phenotypes. They partially overlap with one another in terms of their phenotypes. They share genetic risk factors. There are known alleles that predispose to either two of these or all three of these. They are all known to have high heritability, well over 0.5. Genetic variation underlies the bulk of the variation and expression of these conditions, and they also share some neurological and physiological correlate. Incidence is about 1% worldwide. This comes out to about 60 million people. Pretty similar for bipolar. Depression is much more common, having at least one episode of major depression in one's life, estimated at about 15%. And depression is, I think, the second most important cost to society in terms of lost productivity. Autism is a spectrum, and these conditions are also along a spectrum. They are not either or. We have more or less continuous variation between severe disorders on one hand and all of us normal folks, thank you, on the other. And this has been recognized for a very long time. Annual cost to society, and this is just for schizophrenia, in the UK, about 40 billion Canadian dollar. And that's just the financial cost. Schizophrenia, bipolar, destroys not just individuals, but families. Now, people have been studying schizophrenia and bipolar for a long time. I should mention the first researchers to describe these, Emil Kraepelin and Eugen Bleuler, in the late 1800s and around the turn of the century, first described and characterized these and founded the modern study of these conditions. And Darwin himself was one of the first biologists to actually study insanity and to want to collect data on it. And he said, it occurred to me that the insane ought to be studied as they are liable to the strongest passions and give uncontrolled vent to them. He wrote this in his book on the expression of the emotions in man and animals, and he saw insanity as involving overdevelopment or extreme development of emotions, and observing individuals with these strong emotions, in Darwin's view, provided him with an opportunity to show continuity in emotions between humans and other primates. Okay, so he thought he would get a clearer view of emotions when they were presented in extreme form. So Darwin actually collected data. He collected photographs of people from in asylums, and he studied these to try to draw inferences about these emotional states and how they compare to emotional states in other primates. So nowadays we don't collect photographs to study schizophrenia, bipolar, or major depression. We collect genes. Psychiatric geneticists collect genes. Genes that are for schizophrenia, bipolar, major depression, that have some influence on the risk of these disorders. And the past 15 or 20 years, geneticists have actually been quite successful in finding genes that underlie these disorders. So we have good evidence now that most cases of schizophrenia and bipolar, especially, most of the work has been on schizophrenia, most cases are polygenic. They are due to the cumulative small effects of many common alleles across many loci. So over 100 genes have been linked in at least one study to schizophrenia. And what that means is that there is allelic variation in a population, and if you have one of the alleles, you have a slightly higher risk of having schizophrenia, maybe 2%, maybe 5%, maybe 7%. It's that sort of small effect that we're talking about. It's important to notice that we're talking about common alleles, alleles that are present in this room, that are present in our genomes. You all have schizophrenia risk alleles in your genomes, and those genes are happily expressing themselves in your brain as you sit here. Now, these are common alleles of small effect. Schizophrenia can also be due in a much smaller proportion of cases to few rare alleles of large effect. And so here we can have single genes where if you have loss of function of those genes, then the odds of getting schizophrenia can be very high, up to 100%. And these sorts of rare alleles commonly involve very large genetic, epigenetic, or genomic changes, such as deletion or duplication of a large piece of DNA, or genetic changes in some extremely important gene for example, synaptic function. And these are commonly what we call de novo or new mutations that are highly penetrant. If you have them, the odds of getting schizophrenia are very high. And then we have all sorts of intermediates between these genes of small effect and genes of large effect.